Hello, everyone. I'm Heather Register Zabindin, the Outreach Coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library houses the galleries and bookstore at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. Please go to robertslibrary.org for all the details and come visit us. This program is being live streamed to YouTube and will be available to view on CAL's YouTube channel immediately following the program. The speakers will answer questions at the end of the program. Please type your questions in the chat box in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And now to the program. Tonight, we are joined by Elizabeth Shores and Bill Jones for a discussion of Elizabeth's new book, Shared Secrets, The Queer World of Newbery medalist Charles J. Finger. Elizabeth Shores is an independent scholar and the author of On Harper's Trail, Roland McMillan Harper, Pioneer Botanist of the Southern Coastal Plain, and Erlene's Pink Party, The Social Rituals and Domestic Relics of a Southern Woman. Bill Jones is the author of Petty Jean, A Wilderness Adventure, which is an award-winning historical novella for young readers. He is also the author of the internationally recognized Classics Illustrated, A Cultural History. For nearly a century, British expatriate Charles Joseph Finger was best known as an award-winning author of children's literature. In Shared Secrets, Shores relates Finger's untold story, exploring the secrets that connected the author to the international community of 20th century queer literati. So everyone, please give a warm virtual welcome to Elizabeth and Bill.
Unmute.
There you go. Yes.
And here we are.
Hi there. Who goes first?
Well, if you want to start with your reading, that would be great.
I do have a couple of readings, but what I want to start with is thanking you, Heather, and everyone at the Central Arkansas Library System, including Nate Colton, and particularly Lee Razor, head of the Interlibrary Loan Department for CALS, because I try to never miss an opportunity to thank CALS and the Interlibrary Loan Department, because as an independent scholar myself, I lean on that department a great deal. I really couldn't do it without them. So thank you so very much. And then Bill Jones. I want to thank Bill Jones. It's such an honor to get to talk about Charles Finger with you. You are my beau ideal of the independent scholar. You know, somebody who digs so deeply into subjects. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and also brainstorming with me a little bit in advance about a few questions. That really helped me, because at this point, Heather, it's been about a year since I was thinking about C.J. Finger, all the time. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. And I should say that as one who knew of Charles J. Finger only as an early Newbery medalist back in the days of Charles Boardman Hawes, I imagine that, like me, some in our audience might also need some background on Finger's significance as the fourth recipient of the Newbery Medal for Children's Literature.
Yeah, probably so. So, of course, Hawes was the third recipient, and arguably a more legitimate recipient of the medal, in that children's librarians around the country went to the trouble to write letters to the American Library Association, voting for him or nominating him for the prize. Of course, that was partly a sentimental vote, because Hawes died shortly before his book, The Dark Frigate, was released. But so as it happened, the next year, when the ALA was preparing to consider 1924 releases for the medal, it decided to do things differently, and it appointed a small committee to make the choice of the winner and of the runners-up. And the key member of that committee was a book reviewer and ALA insider named Anne Carroll Moore. And she had fallen in love with Finger's book when she saw The Galleys. And then even more significantly for the whole rest of Finger's life, his editor at Doubleday, Page and Company, May Massey, also was an ALA insider. She had written a column for an ALA newsletter for a long time. And so I argue in Shared Secrets that Finger's receipt of the Newbery Medal in 1925 for his 1924 book, Tales from Silverlands, was as much about the influence of those two women, Moore and Massey, as it was about the quality of his book.
Well, one of the ideas you introduce in that regard is that the Newbery Medal paradoxically meant the end of Finger's career as a serious writer of adult fiction. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and that's such an important thread, I think, in the story of his life. So in a nutshell, C.J. Finger, Charles Finger, spent the first 50 years of his life growing up in London as a ranch hand in Patagonia and the American Southwest, and as a manager of small railroads in Ohio, wishing he could be a writer, even though he had no formal training in literature, and even though he was under immense pressure to support a large family. And then he spent about 5 years working really seriously, really hard to write short fiction for adults in one particular genre, which was exotic adventure stories. And he was breaking into the big time. He had stories published in H.L. Mencken's magazine, The Smart Set, and in several of what were known as little magazines, very prestigious, small literary journals that didn't pay much, but it was very important to his creative development. And so things were going great. And then he accepted a commission from Doubleday Page to write this book of invented folk tales for children, simply as a way to make some money. And he won the Newbery Medal for that first book for children. And he became a genuine star on the book pages of newspapers around the country. And at that time, that was huge. And it just transformed him into this instant icon, this fatherly figure in what was really an emerging field of American children's literature. And he was bombarded with contract offers for more children's books. So the tragedy to me is that in that kind of limelight and with that opportunity to make some real money to support his family, he really could hardly continue writing these modern, experimental, queer short stories for little magazines. And so the Newbery Medal that made him famous really meant the death of his life as a writer for adults.
As I understand it from your book, he was following in a kind of vein of Joseph Conrad, Robert Louis Stevenson, Jack London, this kind of muscular fiction. And that all changed with Tales from Silverlands, which I checked this afternoon and is the only book of his available on Amazon anymore. Mm-hmm. I don't know if others are in print, but at least through Amazon, you can't get anything but that Newbery Medal winner. Wow. The way he went from an emerging short story writer to a blockbuster author of children's books is an interesting tale in itself. Has an interesting cast of characters.
Yeah. He was sort of like a Forrest Gump figure in that he seemed to know everybody, or at least meet them once or twice. But in particular, I think you're talking about Carl Sandburg, And so that story is that when Mae Massey, that editor at Doubleday Page, was still in Chicago, she knew Sandburg very well. She was close friends with Sandburg and his wife. And so then when she went to New York to launch Doubleday's children's list, she reached out to Sandburg and asked him if he could suggest any authors to her, authors who could write fiction for children in international settings. This was right after World War I ended, and Mae Massey really wanted to use children's literature to promote international peace and understanding. Well, Sandburg had just read this thing Finger had written, a commission piece called Lost Civilizations, for this series of condensed books called Little Blue Books. And so Sandburg sent that copy, his copy of Lost Civilizations, to Massey and said, you know, this guy really might be what you're looking for. And Massey saw the potential in Finger, and she wrote to him, and this was a huge turning point in Finger's life, as it turned out. That wasn't the only time Finger did a favor. I mean, that Sandburg did a favor with Finger. He was really good about recommending him to editors and praising his books in reviews.
Well, you've left for me, reading the book, an impression of Sandburg singing folk songs to Finger and his family, and a map that Finger's daughter drew of the artists' colony, which we'll come to later, has a spot noted that Carl Sandburg meditated here.
Right.
So he apparently was quite significant in his life. The Little Blue Books are themselves quite interesting. There's a collector's market for those. They were a leftist publication for the proletariat, basically, making great literature, Emerson, Walt Whitman, etc., available to the masses, as well as original things such as Lost Civilizations by Finger.
Yes. Which reminds me of something. Go ahead. No. I was just, there's something I want to talk about a little later. Okay. Relates to the Little Books.
Shared Secrets is your third biography, and your first two subjects were completely different. First, an early ecologist, and then your own grandmother. Yeah. Does anything tie these books together thematically?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say thematically. I'm so lucky that in the last 10 years or so, I've been able to do what I want. And what I really like to do is solve mysteries. And so I enjoy doing research about people who are, for some reason, in the margins of history. You know, they're obscure. They were obscure in their time, or they've become obscure, and yet there's something interesting about them. And so I guess the commonality is that I enjoy that kind of mystery solving. So my first book, On Harper's Trail, is about Roland Harper. And he, during his lifetime, a lot of people thought of him as a quirky kind of a nut. He was a very hardworking botanist and suffered from or lived with what a lot of people today consider a personality disorder, and that is obsessiveness. But I suggested in my book that it was that very obsessiveness that made it possible for him to collect and analyze vast amounts of field data. And then that led to a really profound realization that Harper had, which was that the practice at the time of fire suppression in forests, both national forests and privately held timber property, fire suppression was actually extremely unhealthy for forests, that fire was a natural part of the ecology of forests. And so today, the whole contemporary regimen of controlled burns is thanks to Roland Harper. Oh. Then as far as my grandmother goes, I was I wanted to try to figure out how it was possible that she was a blasé bystander to the racial terrorism taking place in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, all around her during her lifetime. And what I concluded was that Erlene suffered from three distinct yet related fears that were very, very deep fears that affected every aspect of her life and personality and rendered her literally incapable of empathy. I don't think that excuses her failure to speak out, but I think it explains it.
Hmm.
So Finger is my third book, and I don't think I've been entirely sympathetic with any of my three subjects, but I think with Finger, I have been the most troubled by some of what I learned, and found that he did commit a sort of moral lapse that I think is important to recognize. I got a note a few days ago from a reader who said she really liked the book. In part because I was sympathetic to his struggles as a writer and as the provider for a large family and as a gay man, but that I didn't gloss over the fact that, as she put it, he was a bit of a bastard.
I think you managed that really well. I was really struck by the balance that you achieved in that biography. You sympathize with him, with his struggles as a closeted, or not entirely closeted, but a coded gay man, and yet you held him to account for, well, the moral lapses that we'll return to. Let's talk a bit about queer literature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Seems to me that one of your key ideas is that the pervasive gentlemen's clubs in Victorian London and the art colonies in the US and book culture in the pages of periodicals and newspapers were the phenomena that sort of enabled secret sharers, one might say, to borrow the Conradian term, who could form this kind of community, a virtual community, we might call it, among Finger's friends and readers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's as if those various manifestations of secret societies all kind of coalesced, and Finger had this sort of brainstorm that he could, on the highways and byways of middlebrow publishing, reach out to what he called understanding readers and create that virtual network in the pages of his own literary magazine, which he called All's Well, and in all of the book reviews he wrote. And it was an amazing kind of synthesis, I think, that occurred in his life as it was occurring in the literary world. So as for the gentlemen's clubs, I think that really the only place that Charles Finger ever felt safe to be out as a gay man was in some occasional encounters with other ranch hands or horse traders in Patagonia. Everywhere else he went in his life, he felt like he had to find those hiding places where queer men could see each other safely. And so those gentlemen's clubs in London, which were ubiquitous and by no means were all queer gathering places, but they gave Finger the idea of the private, invitation only men's club where people were safe. And he literally started a men's club everywhere he lived in his lifetime. So those clubs were it for him.
The idea of a gentleman's club in San Angelo, Texas is kind of
it didn't fly, but he did try.
Yes.
So then art colonies were a really big thing in the 20s and 30s in the United States. There were quite a few of them, and they were very cool for a lot of reasons. They were certainly not all or strictly queer getaways, but they did tend to be very open to gender diversity. And Finger really hoped that the farm he started in Fayetteville in 1921 might become such an art colony. And although he did have a great many people who stopped by on their way to somewhere else, he really didn't have any long-term residents, so to speak. So it didn't really pan out. And so then there was that third element of that network that he created, and that was book review culture. And that's a term that the historian Sarah Gardner coined. And she was describing this unbelievable discourse that emerged in the 1920s, the same time when Finger began writing, between writers and reviewers and readers and editors. And it was happening in letters to the editor and in fan letters to writers and in one columnist in a newspaper or magazine commenting on ideas that another columnist had expressed. And it was really all phenomenally rich and sophisticated and entertaining and more interactive than most of what we see online today. And Finger was a genius at engaging in that discourse through his own literary magazine and through hundreds of book reviews that he wrote. So yeah, it all kind of came together in this network that was virtual.
Well, related to that, I guess, to his overall view of the world is that idea of getting away, like Huck Finn lighting out for the territory. He just did not want to be bound by conventions, restraints of any kind.
Right. And he was really inspired even as a child from the literature that he read in London as a little boy. He read these cheaply printed books for children or youth, I guess, that were known as penny dreadfuls, I guess because they cost a penny and parents thought they were dreadful. So one thing was this series called the Jack Harkaway series by Bracebridge Hemming. Finger loved those. Then there were the novels by H. Rider Haggard. He wrote these sort of quest romances for young adult readers, I suppose. You may be able to comment on that more.
King Solomon's Mines, Cleopatra.
Right. And Haggard wrote King Solomon's Mines as sort of a challenge to himself after reading Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. He thought, well, I can do this. And so for the viewers out there in Zoomland, if you don't already know, Bill Jones here is a very respected authority on Robert Louis Stevenson, who edited a collection of essays on his work. And just by the way, one of those contributors was Oliver Buckton, who's a scholar on queer literature, and he was very important to my analysis of Finger. So the circle continues.
Well, yeah, Stevenson was on the, he always was trying to support his family and make more money. And he was approached by the editor publisher of a magazine called Young Folks, which was aimed at boy and girl readers. And they wanted him to come up with a story. And he did a tale called The Sea Cook, which evolved into Treasure Island. And with that book, he sort of reinvented the idea of the boy's adventure story. He made it much darker, had much more adult in its tone. And he's too often, I think, lumped in with children's authors. He really only wrote 3 books specifically aimed at young readers, Treasure Island being the obvious one. And then the sequel, or not sequel, but the follow-up, The Black Arrow, which introduced a heroine because the young female readers of young folks wanted someone along with Jim Hawkins on that treasure voyage. So he goes back to the War of the Roses and introduces a young heroine to match skills with the hero of the book. And then there was Kidnapped, which has always been problematic for younger readers because it relies so heavily on Scots dialect, and it is more a meditation on Scottish culture and history than it is a children's book. But all of these dealt with Stevenson's favorite theme, which asserts itself in Finger's life, and that is the theme of human duality, best known in Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that leads us to that late Victorian. It was not just Stevenson, but other writers in their work or in their lives were dealing with this concept of double lives, of double identity. We see it in Oscar Wilde, most famously and tragically, in The Picture of Dorian Gray, and even in the comedy, The Importance of Being Earnest.
Yeah. Yeah, and Oscar Wilde was, he appears throughout my treatment of Finger's life because he was so important to Finger as a tragic hero. Finger liked to talk about the one time he met Oscar Wilde, which was at an art show in London, and he wrote about it at least 3 times, kind of embroidering that a little more each time. And he also had his children, Finger that is, had his children put on a production of The Importance of Being Earnest at Gayeta, the farm in Fayetteville. So yeah, Oscar Wilde and Duality. So in Finger's work, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask you about that, about how that theme of duality asserts itself.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's where I was going. So when Finger left Patagonia, he wound up in San Angelo, Texas, once again as a ranch hand on a sheep ranch. But he managed to get some part-time work writing for the San Angelo Press, a little weekly newspaper. And very, very luckily for me, that newspaper is online, available online. And so I read years and years of issues of the San Angelo Press, and my husband and I had a great time going to San Angelo and looking at a lot of photographs in an archive there. Anyway, Finger created an alter ego, a persona named Jack Random, and wrote a series of columns for the San Angelo Press under that pseudonym. And in the very first one, he described Jack Random, that is to say himself, sitting beside a stove on a winter night in a bar, which all of that was an allusion to a poem by Walt Whitman. And he wrote literally that he was reading my Walt Whitman. So this was like a neon sign in case there might be a gay man who was passing through San Angelo and picked up the press. This was a neon sign saying hello from Finger, because Whitman was code.
As I understand, people would carry copies of Leaves of Grass as a way of identifying themselves.
Literally, yes. So he had his Jack Random alter ego holding a copy of Leaves of Grass as he sat by the bar on a winter night. Anyway, but Jack Random was his first use of a dual identity, and he played around with that a lot during those years in Texas. And then during the Ohio years, Finger really immersed himself in several distinct kinds of literature, very self-taught as a writer. But one of those genres was literature that was really not yet recognized by the general public as queer lit, but was. Mm. Yeah, duality.
You suggest in the book that the name Jack Random is in part an allusion to Tobias Smollett's Roderick random from the 18th century, but more particularly an allusion to Jack London, one of Finger's literary role models, a wanderer, very much like Finger. And London had his own circle of what I believe you would term understanding friends. Would you talk a bit about George Sterling, the poet, and how that figures into?
Yeah, so George Sterling was in San Francisco. He was a poet. He was a contributor to Reedy's Mirror, which was a St. Louis periodical that Finger worked on for a while. And when Finger started his literary magazine, All's Well, Sterling quickly became a contributor of poems to All's Well. And so he and Finger were frequent correspondents. Sterling was also a close friend of H.L. Mencken. So it was kind of a three-way connection there. So this was one of the episodes that I really had the most fun researching. Finger went out to Seattle in 1925 to accept the Newbery Medal from the American Library Association at its annual meeting. And then he went down to San Francisco to meet Sterling in person. They had not yet met in person. And I actually found, it was a stroke of luck, one of the houses that he went to that one evening he spent with Sterling, a house on Russian Hill in San Francisco. It was for sale at the time I was doing this research. And so I was able to look at the real estate listing and all the photographs of the interior of the house and discover that they had this amazing view from the living room when they went there. So I was able to work that into the scene, so to speak. Sterling was in the advanced stage of alcoholism at that point and had recently been hospitalized. But he and Finger went kind of carousing all night anyway. They went wandering around. They stopped and visited several friends of Sterling, walked up and down Rush Hill, talked to them. And one of the houses they visited was called Flowering Wood, and it was the home of the poet C.E.S. Wood. The house was called Flowering Wall. I assume it had a wall around it with flowers on it. It was the home of C.E.S. Wood and his lover. And so they went there, and I wanted to read a little bit about that.
Please.
Okay. So, leaving Flowering Wall, Finger and Sterling resumed their meander through the San Francisco night, as Sterling reminisced about his own first guide to the city's nightlife, Jack London. They had enjoyed talking about socialism and drinking to excess, and even tried hashish together. London and his wife, Charmian, often had picnics with George and his wife, Carrie, and other bohemian friends. Sterling became London's editor, encouraging a rhythmic, rhyming, expressive voice. He posed in the nude for London to photograph. London called him the Greek, and Sterling called London Wolf, the same endearment that Charmian used for him. London even wrote an erotic poem, unpublished during his life, about Sterling as a godlike man who ran his finger underneath the edge of a flower bud and unfolded it. Sterling was London's great man comrade who loved the flesh as he should love the spirit. Well, Sterling entered a hospital again a week after the time that Finger spent with him. And he died of suicide the next year, a few days before the 10th anniversary of London's death. It was during a visit by Mencken, and Sterling was expected that day at a luncheon in Mencken's honor, but he didn't show up, instead drafting a poem on the back of a menu and noting, "Send this to Mencken," before swallowing cyanide. Oh. "It's justifiable," Finger wrote later. "If you don't like life, then open the door. The key is in your hand." "Sterling was my friend, and I loved him," he wrote, quoting one of Sterling's poems. "Desires and adorations, winged persuasions and veiled destinies, splendors and glooms and glimmering incarnations of hopes and fears and twilight fantasies.
Wow.
So that's a bit about George Sterling.
Was it Sterling who gave Finger the death mask of Jack London?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. That is a really cool story. So immediately after Finger died, someone commissioned a death mask, which was an odd custom at the time, and maybe not really a common custom anymore. Probably it was Sterling who did this. Probably the sculptor was somebody in particular whose name I can't remember, but it's in the book. And there were presumably multiple impressions made or masks made from the impression of London's face. Sterling wound up with one of them. And when Finger was leaving San Francisco, Sterling rushed to the train station to give him some books and also that mask. He actually gave to Finger his own mask of his one-time lover and best friend, Jack London, which, suggests to me that Sterling was already suicidal at that point. So anticipating that he was going to be leaving all his earthly belongings behind. So Finger had that mask, and there's a photograph of it. It actually disappeared sometime later. There was a fire, unfortunately, at Finger's youngest child, Helen's house in Fayetteville. It didn't completely destroy the house. The house was rebuilt. A lot of books were partly burned. I got to look at all of those books. And my guess is that the mask was in the house and it was destroyed in the fire, but no one seems to know anymore what happened to it.
Well, that brings us to Gayeta, or is it Gayeta, more Spanish?
Yeah, well, good question.
But in any event, that name Gayeta was double entendre, and it was part of the code, wasn't it? That Finger was using. Yeah.
So Finger moved to Arkansas at the end of 1920 to restart his life as a serious writer. And he had the idea that because he had all this past experience as a sheep ranch hand, that he could support his family by raising sheep. And so he bought this 100-acre place outside Fayetteville and moved all the family down there, his father-in-law, the housekeeper they had in Ohio. It's kind of incredible. Bought some sheep and started writing stories. And or continued writing stories, I should say. One of the ones he'd already had published, which had been a bit of a sensation, was called Ebro, and that's E-B-R-O. And that was first published in the St. Louis magazine Movies and More. He won some awards for it. And I found Ebro to be the greatest realization of Finger's literary method, which was taking experiences from his years in Patagonia and merging them with these intensively elusive characters and situations. Ebro was a bit of a sensation, even in England. I found writers in England were writing to each other about this story. It was quite something. So he had a character. There was a narrator of the story Ebro, and that narrator has a sexual partner, and he describes how he gave her the name Gayeta. So I wrote this down to show how we spell it. Is that backwards? It looks backwards to me.
No, it shows up.
Okay, so as you see, it's Gayeta. And this was a bit of wordplay. The connotation we know of gay was not yet familiar to the general public, but it was in use in the queer world. And so this was Finger signaling to readers of this story, Ebro, that the story was at least partly autobiographical, and that the sexual partner in the story was actually a man. Then when he gets to Fayetteville, he he named the farm Gayeta, and his house, the first house he built there, Gayeta Lodge. So it's kind of a declaration. Safe place.
There was another intense relationship that Finger had with his lover, George Washington Maddox. And he met him through the stories that Finger was getting published in the 1920s. Would you tell us something about Major Maddox?
Yes, I'd love to. So George Maddox was a pretty high-ranking Army officer who served in France during World War I. And when he came back to the United States, he read, voraciously the many literary magazines that existed. He loved poetry and fiction, and he wrote letters sometimes to writers whom he admired. And so I speculate in the book that the way he and Finger met was because Maddox wrote a fan letter to Finger, but I know that they met in person in a rendezvous they had in St. Louis in 1920. And from that time on, CJ really lived for the next rendezvous with George Maddox. And some of their meetings were on the Gulf Coast in Mississippi, where George's sister was the dean of a small private college for women. And so I have a little passage about one of those Mississippi rendezvous. Being with Maddox in Mississippi inspired Finger to write a passage packed with sensory impressions. Quote, "An air of peace pervaded the entire countryside," he wrote in a travel piece for the Dearborn Independent. "The Gulf was a sweep of pale blue, here alive with flashing white seagulls, there hardly to be distinguished from horizon haze." Some lines presaged the most homoerotic passage of the memoir he later wrote. Quote, "Sometimes quite close to shore, so close that you may hear the voices of the men and the creaking of blocks. You see a fishing schooner, beautiful with bellying sail of brown or white, though the wind is hardly strong enough to ripple the water." Finger's account of this visit was vivid yet vague, like the meandering in sequence and location like one of the wide, slow rivers on the coastal plain. At Biloxi, he and Maddox climbed steep stairs to the top of a tower, probably the Biloxi Lighthouse, and heard the murmur of the sea. Lighthouses could represent, as the scholar Holly Furneaux puts it, interstitial spaces of imaginative possibility. And Finger had made the narrator of his short story, Some Mischievous Thing, a lightkeeper, looking at tall ships in the harbor and the shimmering, winking waves. Finger, quote, "was ablaze with a desire that things which had been might be again," he wrote. His phrases colorfully suggestive. "And while my companion talked, in me was a memory of tropic nights and of scented winds and of the lullaby of lapping waters and the strange green fires of the sea and a morning sun that leapt out of the ocean at the end of a lane flowing ago."
Very nice. Let's talk about another significant figure in Finger's life, and that would be H.L. Mencken, who published some of Finger's stories. He was a larger-than-life Baltimore journalist, editor, satirist, and social critic who despised the South in general. He famously covered the Scopes monkey trial, giving it that name, and Arkansas in particular, though he made an exception for Finger. You indicate that Mencken was extremely important to Finger's development as a writer of serious queer fiction. Would you talk about that a bit?
So, as I said, Finger had a job for a few weeks working for an editor in St. Louis named William Marion Reedy. And Reedy and Mencken had a sort of a close yet antagonistic or competitive sort of relationship as editors. But Mencken really respected Reedy's ability to scope out promising new writers. And so Reedy probably made the introduction for Finger to Mencken. Finger submitted some stories to Mencken. Mencken didn't accept the first ones, but he gave him a lot of very constructive feedback, which was kind of extraordinary. And I go into that a little bit in the book. And then Mencken did begin publishing some stories of Finger's, and it really was the breakthrough. Finger. So yeah, Mencken was his really Finger's greatest patron.
And would you say he was also the greatest betrayal?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and one of the chapters of the book is called Betrayal. And in that I deal with his betrayal of Mencken. And you're mentioning the little blue books. Publishers reminds me that it was also a betrayal of Haldeman Julius, Emmanuel Haldeman Julius, who was the publisher of the little blue books. He was Jewish. At any rate, Finger did a lot of freelance work for a while in the latter half of the 20s for none other than Henry Ford, the car manufacturer, who published a magazine called the Dearborn Independent. This gives you, again, an idea of how incredibly important magazines were to culture in America at that time. He saw a magazine as a way to influence, not only get people to buy his cars, but influence culture and politics. And so Finger did a lot of work for them, and the editors pressured him to write material on Henry Ford's two biggest obsessions. One, the vulgarity of modern art and literature, and two, anti-Semitism. Finger was really uncomfortable about doing this, but he did as he was told. He criticized Mencken repeatedly for publishing and promoting modern writers. The anti-Semitic stuff that Finger wrote for the Dearborn Independent was less, and he did try in a roundabout way later to sort of make amends for that, but there it is, he did it. But I think considering that Finger himself was a modernist writer published by Mencken, and that Finger himself was a member of an oppressed minority, this was definitely the most hypocritical thing he ever did. Something even less forgivable, in my opinion, than the fact that he cheated on his wife.
And basically ignored his wife, Nellie.
Right.
Well, he died in 1941, not long before the U.S. entry into that Second World War. Could you read us a few lines from the book, which does a wonderful job of combining Edward R. Murrow and places familiar to Finger from his youth and young adulthood?
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Bill. For background on this passage, which is then the chapter called The End of the Tale, radio, it was another phenomenal cultural stage, of course, at that time. And the Fingers had a radio, which was a gift to the family from George Washington Maddox. And they listened to it all the time. And so, Murrow was kind of in the background all the time. And here's where I'll start. England declared war against Germany in September 1939. On the radio, Edward R. Murrow reported from London each night, sometimes from rooftops, as bombs fell around him. His updates were like a tour of Finger's England. This afternoon, he said, I spent 2 hours and a gallon of precious gasoline looking at London from Hampstead Heath, where Finger and his friend Charles Peer ambled on a romantic day in 1890, to St. Paul's, near the coffee houses and halls where the radicals gave speeches, to Fleet Street, the home of London's newspapers, and down the Strand, where Finger saw the gondoliers at the Savoy Theatre, to Trafalgar Square, the site of Cunningham Graham's stand. On New Year's Eve, Murrow delivered a message rather like Finger's annual greeting, but in a sorrowful, chilling context. Quote, the end of 1939 finds 1 million men are under arms in Britain. Homes have been broken up by evacuation, and tens of thousands of men and women are manning searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, fire engines, and ambulances. Finger became more depressed as Germany advanced upon England, and the Lord Privy Seal Clement Attlee told the House of Commons, as Murrow reported, quote, we are free men fighting for our lives, and in order that we may fight more effectively, we must give up our freedom. During the Battle of Dunkirk, Murrow described a man in Regent Street with a sign that read, watch and pray. Murrow drove around southern England, quote, through hop fields and between high hedges, the countryside where Finger took a great tramp in 1889. Prime Minister Winston Churchill told the House of Commons, quote, we shall go to the end. We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, in the hills. We shall never surrender. Finger could barely listen to the war news over the radio. It makes me sick, he wrote to John Gould Fletcher. Finger was not well. When Fletcher and his wife, Charlie Mae Simon, came for a visit in November 1940, Finger's face was deeply lined, his hair thin and white, and his eyes tired. He had to lie down on the sofa to chat with him. The couple took him on a drive, and Finger surprised Fletcher by confessing that recently he had begun praying. He recited the Lord's Prayer in the prayer. The Fletchers departed on Armistice Day. Bidding them farewell, Finger asked in Spanish, when shall we meet again? 5 days later, a large bomb hit Shepherd Market in Mayfair, and fires broke out on the streets that were the setting of Finger's earliest memories. The Fayetteville newspaper reported that Southampton, where Helen remembered a forest of chimney pots, was engulfed in an ocean of flames. Bristol was bombed heavily and repeatedly. Hitler's promise, reported on December 10th, was to defeat the entire world. And so I go on from there to describe a letter that Finger received right after that from George Maddox. But I won't share that part. I'll let that be a surprise for readers.
Well, I think you're mentioning John Gould Fletcher reminds me of a poem that was recited at the memorial service for Charles Finger, written by John Gould Fletcher and read by Finger's daughter, Helen, an artist who illustrated some of his books. And these lines seem really apposite. Few men have known this steadfast, changeless man, broad, deep, untamed as those unfettered seas which beat on Patagonian cliffs to span the ages with their storms, their broken memories. What do you have coming up next? What project are you working on?
Thank you for reading that poem. So what I'm working on now is a biography of William Woodruff. And our listeners probably all know that he was the founder of the Arkansas Gazette, the first newspaper in Arkansas and the first newspaper west of the Mississippi. So the story of the Gazette under Woodruff's years has really been told already, very capably by other writers, but I'm trying to do something different. Woodruff came to Arkansas in 1819 when the territory was still emerging from the colonial period. And he came from Long Island, and he was entering a totally different world. It was a society based on slavery, based on the exploitation of Black people. And so what I'm trying to do is tell the story of Woodruff vis-a-vis the enslaved people who were all around him during his lifetime. You know, of course, it's really not possible just from digging around in archival materials to actually imagine the lives of enslaved people, but we can at least look at Finger's actions. I mean, Woodruff's actions as a slaveholder. So that's what I'm trying to do. My working title is Reckoning, William Woodruff and the Dark Heart of Arkansas, which is an allusion to the whole history of writing about colonialism, and of course to one of Finger's most important influences, Joseph Conrad.
Well, thank you. I see there are a couple of questions here, and
Hey, Heather.
I'm back.
do you want to read the question? I see one from Layette Johnson. Would you read that, Heather?
Yes. In chapter 10, it's clear how Finger was under so much pressure to get that next commission to make money. Mr. Jones were illustrators like Paul Arnier, maybe? Is that correct? Did I pronounce it? Arnier?
Yeah.
And Classics Illustrated artists under the same kind of pressure as Finger? And if so, how did that affect the quality of their work?
That is an excellent question. I found in working on the Classics Illustrated book that there were book illustrators. Thank you. There were book illustrators who were beginning their careers, and they tended to write for, to illustrate for magazines or comic strips if they were headed in that direction. And if at the beginning of the story of Classics Illustrated and of the golden age of comics, if you were well established, you took a different path. But if you were really young, as many of the early Classics Illustrated artists were, or if you were really old, as some of them were as well, then you would find yourself pushing to get those pages in a comic book because there were more pages that you had to illustrate on a commission, and you were paid less on the whole, but it was income. So yes, there was a lot of pressure on illustrators in the Depression and the years coming out of it. Did you have any comments on Paul Honoré or?
Oh yeah. Thanks for the Paul Honoré illustrated Tales from Silverlands and a lot of Finger's other books for children. And he is an absolutely fascinating figure himself, in my opinion, in the history of publishing in this country. And he had a lot of things in common with Finger. He studied for a while in London. And they were very, very close friends for a while. In fact, Honoré traveled with Finger and George Maddox a couple of times. Eventually, Honoré stopped working with Finger, and I really tried and could not figure out whether that was just, the way the cookie crumbled or if there was some sort of falling out. I don't know.
Did he begin working with his daughter at that time, Helen, as illustrator?
Right. So Finger had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. The youngest was Helen, and she was a talented drawer. And he, CJ Finger, really had it in mind for a while that Helen would become the family breadwinner, that she would be such a successful freelance illustrator that she could take over, subsidizing the farm and supporting her mother, Eleanor. And by the way, let's go ahead and acknowledge C.J. Finger's wife was Eleanor Ferguson Finger, a lovely woman. Anyway, he wanted Helen to bring in money as an illustrator. And where was I going with that? Oh, Honoré. When Honoré quit working with Finger, he started trying to get publishers to pay Helen to illustrate his books. And that actually worked. They did 2 travel books together. Finger's career was sort of winding down at that point.
Heather, are there any other questions?
I don't see any other questions in the chat yet, but I have a couple of questions. Is Gayeta still there? I mean, is it a place?
Yes, yes, it absolutely is. I got to spend quite a bit of time there. It's in Fayetteville, within the city limits. I think it's about 3 miles from the campus, university campus. And it's now the home of one of Finger's grandsons, Robert B. Leffler, who is a professor of law at the University of Arkansas and also various universities in Japan. He's a world authority on Japanese health law. But he acquired the family property at some point, and he and his wife, Sarah May Leffler, raised their daughter there. And they invited me in and gave me access to CJ's personal library, which is still in the house, which was a phenomenal boon to my research. So it's a property of a few acres with the house that CJ built, the barn that CJ built, some other outbuildings, a charming little half underground studio that he built for Helen, the daughter, who was the drawer. And then also a gallery that the Lefflers built on the property. Very interesting place. Mm-hmm.
And for Arkansas lawyers, that connection with Robert Leffler's family is really significant.
Yeah.
He was Mr. Torts, the present. Mr. Professor Leffler's father was
the dean of the law.
Demigod in legal circles.
Yeah.
So how did you discover Charles Finger? I mean, how did you... I'm always fascinated with how people find their topics. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah. For most of my career, I had a day job as an editor of some kind. And, so I had to find research projects that were handy in one way or another. So I just kind of continued with that mentality. And I learned from Rob Leffler that he and his brother, Charles Leffler, had donated a very large collection of C.J. Finger's papers, his correspondence, manuscripts, to the archive at the University of Arkansas, the special collections in the library. And it had been 10 years and very little had been done with that collection. And they were, Rob and Charles Leffler were sort of disappointed about that. And so it sounded like, this sounds like a real jackpot for me. It's a huge source of material in one handy location and no one else has tackled it. This sounds fun. So I went up there and I did this sort of cursory look at the stuff in the archive, and I went out to Gayeta and met the Lefflers and walked around the property and all that. And I said, well, this really looks like a great opportunity, and I would love to do it if you can agree to a couple of things. And one of them is that you won't give anyone else access to the books, CJ's personal library, while I'm doing my research. And the other is you understand you have absolutely no input on what I write. And Rob and Charles Leffler said, sure, no problem. So that was really great. Then the Arkansas Historical Quarterly published a very fine article by Ethel Simpson, a retired archivist at the University of Arkansas, about Charles Finger. Yeah. Great. But I got in touch with Ethel and said, so are you planning to do more on this? Because if you are, I'll stop. And she said, no, I'm done with Finger. You go right ahead. So I carried on.
Great.
And had a great time.
We do have another question. This is from Findley Johnson.
Oh, okay.
Where in the world will your research take you next? Do you have any trips planned for more research?
Okay. So Findley is my son, and he thinks I should travel more. So that's what's behind that question. And actually, Findley, I had lined up, thanks to your dad, what was going to be a very cool expedition up the Arkansas River from Arkansas Post from the mouth of the White River up to the point of the first dam. And the reason for that was to see what the Arkansas looked like at the time Woodruff and all of the other people that I'm writing about in Reckoning were making their way up the Arkansas to Little Rock. Well, the pandemic started, and nobody wanted to get in a small boat and spend the day together in a small boat during COVID. So I haven't made that trip yet, but I hope I still get to do that.
I don't know how many times this last year I've heard, well, then the pandemic hit, and so we had to rearrange. So now hopefully you'll get to take that trip.
Yes, yes. Heather, this has been a blast. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Well, thank both of you for doing this. This has been wonderful. I agree.
Thank you for all the people who tuned in, and I hope you'll get the book. I think the book's available at the library and probably also at our local independent bookstores. So please go look for it. I appreciate it.
I put that in the chat. You can get it from the library. You can get it from the bookstore. You can also order it from the U of A Press. So
true. That's true.
I always like to plug them as well. But
the authors always appreciate royalties.
Thank you for. I am remiss. I should have thanked them at the top. Thank you to the University of Arkansas Press for publishing my book.
Well, thank you both for doing this. This was fabulous tonight. And just keep up with what we're doing at Roberts Library and what we're doing with the library system. Hopefully in September, fingers crossed, we'll be back in person for a lot of these programs. But thank you, and everybody have a great evening.
Thank you.